Gildan Media, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Responsible Corporation in a Global Economy. Edited by Colin Crouch and Camilla Maclean. Narrated by Rosemary Benson. Forward. The Social Trends Institute, STI, is an international research center dedicated to the analysis of globally significant social phenomena and trends. Composed of 4 branches of research: marriage and family, biotechnology and bioethics, culture and lifestyles, and corporate governance, STI holds a series of experts meetings that bring together experts on given topics relevant to the respective branch of research to submit original papers and discuss them. This volume, The Responsible Corporation in a Global Economy, is the result of one such meeting, which was held in March 2009 at Warwick Business School, under the leadership of Professor Colin Crouch. It is widely accepted that most social phenomena are too complex to be properly understood from a single academic discipline, and, as such, STI is committed to a multidisciplinary approach. Accordingly, the Responsible Corporation in a Global Economy meeting brought together scholars from business, philosophy, and ethics, and practitioners from a range of organizations, such as Novartis and IBM. STI initiated this project with an interest in examining the moral dimensions of the corporation, operating in a global and increasingly complex world. Much of the existing literature on corporate social responsibility emphasizes 3 different approaches: the entrepreneurial approach, by which the corporation in itself is potentially a moral institution, provided that every person behaves morally; the legal approach, by which a legal framework is necessary in order to make sure that no unethical decisions are taken in the corporation that have a negative impact on the stakeholders and on society; and the good citizen approach, that supports the idea that the corporation could develop further and better in the society to which it belongs by its own rights and merits. But there is room for new thought here, and given the recent developments connected to the global financial and economic crisis, with its moral dimensions affecting both the developed world and the emerging economies, the new perspective is necessary for better understanding the responsible corporation. Indeed, in a globalized world, a fresh examination of the new corporate responsibilities is both timely and necessary. Although STI does not endorse every viewpoint herein, it hopes that these contributions will bring listeners closer to an understanding of the current issues related to the global corporate world and its implications for decision-makers at the governance and executive levels. Carlos P. Cavallé, President and Chairman, Social Trends Institute, Barcelona, 2010. 1. Introduction. The Economic, Political, and Ethical Challenges of Corporate Social Responsibility. Camilla Maclean and Colin Crouch. Corporate social responsibility, CSR, began life as a strategy adopted by certain large corporations to acquire good reputations, or avoid bad ones, for their conduct outside the strict sphere of their market operations, in their relations with local communities, or society and the environment in general. As such, there was always room for debate whether it was serious or just an element of corporate public relations. Today, it is increasingly being seen as a potential form of economic governance, not just corporate governance, though it has implications for that, but also governance of the economy and even of society at large. To consider CSR in this way renders it explicitly political, and one of our principal tasks in this volume is to bring the study of CSR into political science debate. In doing so, we examine different CSR issues, from those in the extensive literature within management research. More precisely, we want to confront business and political science perspectives on the subject with each other. A second major purpose is to confront CSR with certain ethical questions. This kind of discussion, usually under the name of business ethics, is far more common. It, too, is thrown into some new perspectives when set in a political context, as this also brings into scrutiny the state's claims to ethical leadership in secularized societies. Politics and CSR are fields that rarely meet, much less than either does with sociology or with economics. Corporations and firms have been and continue to be exhorted to behave responsibly. Indeed, many corporations now accept that they have social and environmental responsibilities that go beyond their market roles. But for politics and political science, this is just the beginning of the story of what it means to accept corporations as political actors. So, whilst for some the ubiquity of CSR may seem to render further discussion superfluous, there is considerably less discussion and debate on the political implications of major firms shaping regulatory frameworks and taking on social responsibilities that go beyond their market activities. In a sense, this development is a paradoxical consequence of the neoliberal turn in political economy. This began, inter alia, with a process of deregulation and a reduction in the economic role of government, and therefore as a strengthening of the boundaries between polity and economy that should characterize a pure market regime. To a large extent, this did not happen. Deregulation often meant re-regulation, new forms of regulation designed to enforce markets rather than restrict them, and new checks on markets and firms, some of which became involved in various abuses following their deregulation. These range from the scandals affecting Enron, WorldCom, Arthur Andersen, and many other large corporations at the start of the 21st century to the conduct of much of the global financial sector less than 10 years later. The overall weakening of simple deregulation occurred for a variety of reasons, but two of them have been of particular importance for promoting and politicizing the importance of CSR. First, in many sectors, markets have been far from pure. Second, market forces were unable to remedy a number of major negative externalities. The first point relates to the role of large oligopolistic transnational corporations, TNCs, in several important sectors, especially those affected by globalization. These firms may well be engaged in competition, sometimes fierce competition, among each other. But markets of this kind differ in more than one characteristic from the pure market of economic theory. TNCs are not the passive price takers and respondents to demand signals envisaged in theory. They shape their markets and have high visibility. Operating across the globe, they are also partly beyond the regulatory reach of national governments. The associated rise in the number of economic issues that cannot be resolved at the level of individual nation-states means an increase in those that are governed by individual firms or groups of firms, rather than by public authorities. These include standardization and the management of multinational supply chains. Whether or not one calls this globalization, it cannot be claimed to be the operation of markets tout court, and it presents interesting questions to formal national politics and for issues of governance. The prominence that this accords to giant firms makes them, whether they want it or not, political actors, vulnerable to criticism. It is difficult for them to respond to allegations of bad social behavior by proclaiming that they are only in existence to make money, as this can damage their reputations with important groups of customers, possibly even investors and employees. They therefore find themselves under pressure to develop political sensitivities alongside their financial, marketing, and technical competences. Indeed, when we talk of a responsible corporation in the global economy, it is TNCs, or the globally integrated enterprise, to which reference is made. We largely follow this emphasis in this book because of the global reach and range of influence upon economic and societal governance issues that such firms have. The issues at stake in these criticisms usually concern negative externalities. By definition, it is difficult for the market to correct what may be perceived as negative consequences flowing from a firm's activities that are outside the range of its price calculations. The classic case of a negative externality is pollution. There is a classic market answer to pollution and other cases of social cost. If the damage caused to those suffering from a firm's pollution is greater than the loss to the firm of controlling the pollution, then it is in the interests of those persons to pay the firm to impose the controls, as this costs them less than suffering from the continued pollution. If, on the other hand, the cost of dealing with the pollution is greater than the cost of putting up with it, as revealed by victims' willingness to pay, then overall welfare is served by allowing the pollution to continue. This is sound reasoning, provided there are no serious distributional issues in the relations between polluter and victims, and provided the latter are an identifiable set capable of taking collective action, without state help, to decide whether to pay and how much to pay for the controls. But the environmental issues at the forefront of current debate fail to meet these conditions. Climate change and the reduction of biodiversity create vast, unknowable cost calculations, the threat of long-term damage, and a generalization of harm such that identifying victims and potential victims and enabling them to make rational cost calculations becomes impossible. Meanwhile, the physical and social impact of a Western transnational corporation on a developing country raises severe distributional issues that it is difficult for even market theory to ignore. Other questions that are prominent in CSR discussions, such as fair trade, labor exploitation in global supply chains, and the accidental responsibility of Western TNCs for the spread of HIV/AIDS in Africa, lack the global significance of climate change and biodiversity reduction, but they are too difficult for the market approach to manage. This is both true on collective action grounds and because of the distributional inequalities between the putative antagonists. It has been the fate of neoliberalism to triumph at an historical moment when its need for a world in which almost everything of significance can be converted into market exchanges is severely challenged. Implications of the ethical dimension. But polity and economy are not the only spheres engaged in CSR. It is unavoidably implicated in ethical debate. All CSR claims can, in principle, be met with the response, "So what?" If a group or interest negatively affected by corporate behavior has no capacity to solve its problem using political clout or money, then it can be ignored. In reality, the majority of potential claims around the world are met in precisely this way. What is interesting, however, is that sometimes they are not. The people who campaign against the use of child or slave labor in supply chains devote attention to publicizing the effects on small coffee producers of the purchasing strategies of global coffee buying firms, or lobby firms and governments to do something about the obesity consequences of many fast foods, are not usually personally damaged in any way by the corporate activities that make them angry. While the major environmental issues do have real negative implications for very large numbers of people, they are usually more than a couple of generations into the future, and action about them based solely on self-interest would meet a very severe block from the logic of collective action. It is impossible to observe conflicts over CSR and the presentation of firms' own positions on CSR issues without concluding that ethical issues have a real resonance among the publics of modern societies. It is an unreliable, unevenly distributed, and often hypocritical resonance. It is also highly fragmented and internally divided. For some, a Western TNC in a Muslim country that advances the careers of its female employees, allowing them to become superior to some males, and permits them to dress how they choose, is committing grave moral offenses against God's order in the interests of corporate profit-making. For others, it is advancing the values of gender equality and women's liberation. For others again, it is distorting local customs and disrupting community values by imposing its power and wealth. For some, a pharmaceuticals firm investing in research using human embryos is advancing the possibilities of saving and enhancing human lives through new medical treatments. For others, the research itself has ignored the sanctity of human life for the sake of corporate profits. Polity, economy, and the ethical sphere all have organizations, states, corporations, and churches, used here as a shorthand term for all religious organizations, that shape, deploy, and target the resources, respectively power and wealth, that are their special preserve. All three are sites of major competition and conflict. In the polity, these are restrained, externally by risks of war, internally by democracy, where it exists, and in general by a need to come to terms with corporations and markets, very few states being able to ignore the importance of material wealth. In the economy, competition and conflict are governed by the market and by state regulation. Competition and conflict among churches should, in principle, be resolved through demonstrations of divine approval. In the absence of clear signals of this, religious leaders have often appealed to states to lend their power to support one religion against another, often with success. Within at least the Western world, there was, however, eventually a great cost to this from the point of view of religion. So often the arbitrator between religious, and therefore frequently ethical, claims, the state became itself the social location for the assertion of value claims and the resolution of ethical disputes. The French Revolution was the locus classicus of this development, but during the following 2 centuries it spread to many other societies. It was aided by the growth of democracy, which erected the political arena as the place where disputes of all kinds about goals and commonly held values should be ventilated and resolved. Given the weakness of religious organizations in much of the world, and the concentration of corporations on profit maximization, the state became the location that appeared to combine both a responsibility for externalities and other collective and public goals, and possession of the means to impose certain interpretations of those goals. As a result, most of the issues that appear on the CSR agenda will also appear, and might most prominently appear, on the agenda of politics. The rise of CSR can be seen as a challenge to this potential state monopoly over the realm of collective values in a secular society, on behalf of firms in some way rejecting the assignment of themselves to amoral performance in the market. This is not new. For centuries, many business people have felt themselves to be motivated and constrained by religious or secular moral beliefs about appropriate behavior, whether in the actual conduct of their firms, in the relationship of their firms to their surrounding communities, or in philanthropic activities financed by their business profits. Indeed, the father of CSR, Howard Bowen, who wrote the seminal 1953 book The Social Responsibilities of the Businessman, may have been a business school dean, but his book had been commissioned by the Federal Council of the Churches of Christ in America as part of a 6-volume study on Christian ethics and economic life. But his and other similar approaches were developed during periods of capitalism that did not place absolute stress on the maximization of shareholder value as the sole goal of business, as does current Anglo-American corporate governance doctrine. The idea that a firm's sole purpose is to maximize its shareholders' profits, and that, provided markets are pure, this will also be in the interests of consumers, is not the only concept of corporate purpose to be found in modern capitalism. For example, both at law and in social imagination, the German firm has responsibilities to a number of identifiable stakeholders. It was the financial deregulation, and then globalization processes released from the 1980s onwards, that produced the gradual victory of shareholder maximization over other views of the company, as firms not pursuing this maximization made themselves vulnerable by takeover by those who did. Whether one interprets CSR as a fight back from European firms against this Anglo-American approach, or as that approach itself finding a need to rediscover its own roots back to a wider set of responsibilities that still excludes the state, there is certainly a tension between profit maximization narrowly defined and the demands of CSR. Religions, states, and firms, therefore, all seek some share of an ethical agenda. This can be problematic, as both firms and states can be accused of stepping outside their proper sphere when they do so. Complaints that it is no business of governments to interfere in moral issues, or that firms should stick to making profits and not get involved in ethical questions, are widely heard, and from many different shades of opinion. On the other hand, the cynically amoral state or corporation are both chilling prospects. It is a part of the fragmented nature of the world of values in modern societies that we cannot be sure where the limits on ethical engagement by large, powerful organizations should be drawn. Expressing the point somewhat differently, we want all these institutions to behave ethically, but cannot trust them to do so, as none of them is fit to bear the burden of full ethical responsibility. Governments are fundamentally motivated by the desire of certain individuals to wield power, occupy office, and enjoy certain privileges, subject in democracies to the constraints of periodic elections. Firms are fundamentally motivated by the desire of certain individuals to wield power and amass great wealth, subject in market economies to their ability to offer products or services that people are willing to buy. And religious organizations sometimes put the aggrandizement and protection of their organizations, qua organizations, before the values that they claim to represent. Any of these centers of power can become dangerous if it seeks to advance itself without regard to ethical criteria. Any can also become dangerous if it uses its power to impose and insist on particular values. Seen in this broader perspective, CSR is just one of a number of areas where the combination of powerful organization and ethical concerns presents deep ambiguity. Civil society. Polity, economy, religion, and other value-asserting structures are all located within a wider social space. This can be partly seen as a passive arena inhabited by citizens of states, customers of firms, and followers of faith, who do not play an active part in CSR or any other public agenda, but it also contains people, whose values lead them to be active in campaigns that use both citizenship and, increasingly, the power of customers to campaign across all these realms. This is the sphere generally known today as civil society. This troublesome concept has had a long and varied career. The original Aristotelian idea of the polis that lies at its heart signified all areas of public life, using public to refer to the ordered life of the city-state, where free male citizens dealt with matters concerning their life together. It included market, religion, and polity within itself. When Aristotle was translated into Latin, which took place in the city-state of 16th century Florence, polis was translated as societas civilis. From this, then, sprang the phrase civil society. In the following centuries, the city-states of Europe became overwhelmed, as had the Greek ones during Rome's imperial period, by states that stood outside and over the rest of society. Aristocratic and monarchic elites monopolized control of the state within their family groupings, and weakened the towns, which had preserved something of the public unity of market, polity, and values. The state became at best detached from the rest of the public sphere, at worst a part of the household of the ruler. Therefore, when the concept of civil society began to be used again in the 19th century, it usually excluded the state. The concept had been stood on its head. For Karl Marx, civil society became the market. Relationships of exchange that alienate man from his species life. Oddly, however, Aristotle's own Greek word, polis, continued to be used to denote the polity. The concept returned again to prominence in the late 20th century, with thinkers, initially in Central Europe and Latin America, trying to identify a realm of dialogue and human exchange excluded by polity and market alike, the latter being seen as both alienated exchange and large corporations. So Marx's account itself had now been stood on its head. Today, not only in social philosophy, but in common parlance, civil society is usually used to denote those organizations and informal groupings that concern themselves with public affairs, but which operate outside the power of both state and firm. Significantly, they have become known by the nonsensical name non-governmental organizations, NGOs. Whether civil society now includes religious organizations is left ambiguous. They are usually included when they have lost their power, which reinforces the idea of civil society as the power of the powerless, to use the phrase invented by Václav Havel during his years of struggle against communist rule in Czechoslovakia. Civil society certainly includes, though extends further than, the voluntary sector. It tends now to refer to all extensions of the scope of human action beyond the private that lack recourse to the primary contemporary means of exercising power, the state and the firm. Many of the campaigns that today bring an issue to the agenda of CSR have originated in civil society defined in this way. Where 20 years ago such organizations as, say, Amnesty International would channel most of their energies towards the state, today they concentrate some attention on corporations, typically Western firms operating in countries with poor human rights records. The reasons are shot through with the same ambiguity that has dogged this discussion. In many developing countries, TNCs are the only organizations with any power to take serious action about any major issue, certainly more significant than the local state. They are also more vulnerable to pressure than the local state, as most of their customers are to be found within the developed world, and among these are many people sensitive to ethical issues and sufficiently confident of their social efficacy to do something about them. Corporations that acquire bad reputations in their treatment of human rights, the environment, supply chains, or various other issues can expect to be punished in the market by customers. Civil society activists have learned how to add the power of the customer to that of the citizen. This development is by no means the same as what is usually called the business case for CSR, but it exists alongside it in an often positive relationship. The business case tries to cut through the standard debate within the business world itself over CSR. which confronts economic arguments against CSR with ethical or political ones for it. The pro-CSR business case seeks to trump the anti-
Sample complete. Ready to continue?